The email from HR came just after 7 in the morning. It was short, polite, and painfully familiar. Hi, Julia. Let's meet at 9:15 in room 3A to go over your salary review for the new year. There was no subject line suggesting recognition. No manager copied in, just a quiet calendar slot for a meeting I didn't ask for. My name is Julia Mendez. I've been with Leora Tech for 25 years. I lead the team that keeps our infrastructure stable, the kind of work no one notices unless something crashes. I don't give keynotes or launch new platforms, but I've been the one they call when deadlines close in and nothing works. I've survived 3 reorgs, 2 data center migrations, and a decade of being the one who fixes other people's shortcuts. Not because I chase attention, but because I never let a system fail on my watch. At 9:15, I walked into room 3A. Leon from HR greeted me with a practiced smile and a tablet already open on the desk between us. "We really appreciate your consistency during the past year," she said. "The leadership team has approved a 5% salary increase starting next month." She paused like she expected that to mean something. No mention of the 5 years I'd gone without any raise. No acknowledgement of the last-minute recoveries, the overnight patch deployments, or the fact that I've held our legacy backbone together without a single critical outage. Just 5%. Quiet, forgettable, and late. I gave a single nod. That seemed to be all she was hoping for. At 10, I walked into the leadership meeting for the new quarter. Alec was already at the front, adjusting his slides. Servos, the $30 million international integration deal, was projected across the screen. Alec's name was everywhere. He used to shadow me. Now, he was the new lead. As the meeting began, the head of engineering glanced in my direction. "Let's also thank Julia for keeping our systems stable through last year. That gave us the foundation for this opportunity." There was a light round of applause, the kind that fades before it lands. Then they turned back to Alec. He knew the material. He had the energy. But when slide 4 came up, I leaned forward. They were planning to run Servos data through the legacy routing gateway, the same one I rebuilt by hand during the 2018 logistics collapse. The one I flagged twice as unfit for real-time external traffic. It was still in use because rebuilding it would have cost too much at the time. Now, it was holding a deal that could collapse under its weight. No one had asked. No one had even remembered the risks. After the meeting, I went back to my desk, not to complain, just to look. I opened a console I'd built years ago, back when our systems needed constant triage. It wasn't a hidden tool, just one no one else had touched in a long time. Inside it, in the fallback chain, there was a logic branch I'd written during a maintenance overhaul. It didn't stop anything outright. It simply paused transmission if incoming data didn't meet certain formatting rules. A small delay, just enough to raise a flag for review. It was meant to slow things down quietly if something came in wrong. Not to cause failure, but to prevent it. No one ever noticed it. No one ever removed it. And I never turned it off. It wasn't revenge. It was insurance. Written at a time when people still cared what happened beneath the interface. They didn't promote me. They didn't remove me. They just stepped around me, assuming the things I built would keep working without me. But systems age. And when no one listens to warnings, the failure doesn't shout. It just waits. And then, one day, it stops. The conference room was already arranged when I arrived. No welcome, no small talk, just pre-printed handouts and a deck titled Servos Integration, Final Routing Plan. Alec's name appeared on the first slide. The formatting was cleaner than mine. The tone was faster. But the logic? I recognized the structure instantly. It was my draft, the one I'd written during 2 back-to-back shifts last quarter. Except now, the version on the table had no signature, no version ID, and none of the annotations I'd added as flags for future risk. They'd copied the bones, scrubbed the fingerprints, and moved on. I wasn't on the agenda. My name didn't appear in the rollout team list either, but I stayed quiet and sat down in the back row. That's how it works here. You don't get removed. You get erased line by line until you start thinking maybe you were never part of it. The meeting opened fast. Brandon called out a slide showing a dashboard of system behavior. 3 sync stalls, each within a 48-hour window. He didn't ask questions, he made statements. The Servos team had flagged anomalies and wanted technical justification by Friday. Alec nodded along, flipping through slides without hesitation. There was no room for clarification, no pause to consider how an adaptive routing layer might behave differently if old fallback conditions weren't disabled properly. The exact kind of scenario I'd planned for, and the one they'd ignored. Chloe sat halfway down the table. She was scanning a printout with a highlighter, pausing now and then at diagrams she hadn't seen before. I saw her eyes rest on one flow chart with a subtle loop back. It was the kind of thing most engineers missed, until it triggered a legal clause. She didn't ask anything. She didn't have to. I could tell she'd noticed something didn't line up. The meeting ended without debate. Brandon didn't assign ownership. He just said, "Close it." No further explanation. Everyone dispersed, except me and Chloe. She lingered, still flipping back to the flag diagram. I waited a beat, then walked out without acknowledgement. Instead of returning to my floor, I went down to the lower archive. Few people used it anymore. Digital replaced paper years ago, but some systems leave better traces in ink. Inside a locked cabinet, I pulled out a folder from 2019. Tucked between two pages was a clause I'd added by hand during the servos pilot. Not dramatic, not secret, just clear. Clause 4.3, if fallback routing is bypassed without formal override, risk of upstream overwrite is transferred to the operator. That clause never made it into the final version, but I'd kept the original, printed, signed, date-stamped. At noon, I slipped a sealed envelope into Compliance's internal mail drop. No return address, no signature, no email trail. By 1:12 p.m., Chloe accessed the internal documentation vault. She didn't pull a digital file. She requested physical access. 5 minutes later, she opened the archive where the original legal sync chain lived. At 1:43, the compliance system flagged a passive alert. Missing override record, fallback protocol chain. No mention of Alec. No link to me, but the signal was planted. At 2:06, audit opened a silent case. By 3:30, Alec was back in the dashboard, manually inspecting logs. Brandon called for an internal routing report, and I returned to my desk and updated a single sentence in my private file. Clause delivered, no reply expected, reaction underway. By the next morning, I saw the ripple forming. A silent compliance alert had turned into a flagged inquiry. Not public, not dramatic, just a change in access logs. Someone from audit had reopened the integration approval folder. Someone else had cloned the archive test route and moved it into an isolated review space. None of this was shared on Slack. No status updates, no buzz. But I'd worked long enough to recognize the signs of internal tightening. When documents start duplicating without version history, it means people are preparing for something they might be asked to explain later. At 9:42 a.m., I noticed the old fallback clause had been scanned and re-uploaded. Not by me. The file path showed it came from Chloe's user ID. The document I dropped silently was now moving through official channels. But not up to Brandon. Not yet. It landed instead in the inbox of Marta, the legal assistant who used to shadow me during pre-deal redlining. Quiet, methodical, and generally overlooked. Until she caught a phrasing error in a supplier contract that almost invalidated 6 months of negotiation. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly a year. I didn't need to. I'd seen her work, and she followed trails better than most investigators. By mid-morning, Marta had retrieved 2 more files, a memo I'd written last October about temporary logic exceptions, and an email thread where Brandon had signed off on disabling them for operational speed. That thread had no attachments, because the documents were too large to include inline. I'd sent them as drive links. He never opened them. The system marked the message as sent, not accessed. No one had ever followed up. Until now. Marta pulled the full chain into the internal case log. It was titled, Integration Logic Deviation, Source Verification Requested. The metadata showed Chloe had added her name as the preliminary reviewer. Still no mention of me. Which was good, because while they were piecing together what had happened, I was reviewing the bigger question. What would servos do if they realized our system had rejected their stream not by accident, but by design? They hadn't asked for damages yet, but they were sending more detailed queries now about how our systems handled non-standard input, what tests had been performed, whether fallback routing had been cleared by legal. I knew what was coming, and I knew the only thing that could protect the company was the document no one had finished reading. because no one had forwarded it in time. That message, that memo, was still sitting in an unread folder under Brandon's name, time-stamped, unopened. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd written the warning, he'd ignored the notification. Now Chloe had recovered the evidence, Marta had logged the decision trail, and someone else, someone I didn't even know, was about to raise the first formal red flag. I wasn't named in any of it, but I was everywhere inside it. Brandon's response came fast. Not to clarify, not to investigate, but to control the story. He took the clause Chloe submitted, stripped its metadata, rewrote the summary, and distributed a new internal memo under the heading Temporary Routing Policy, Closed Item. It bypassed audit. It bypassed legal. It went straight to operations, tagged as informational. No action required. But his mistake wasn't in what he said. It was in who he copied. The compliance team received the new version, but they also had the original. Chloe had already logged her submission with the version history intact. Marta had archived it inside the legal repository. And the audit system, running independently, had time-stamped the first version with origin path, file author, and classification. Which meant Brandon's memo now contradicted not one record, but 3. He didn't know this. Not yet. Instead, he doubled down. Alec received a soft warning from HR. One of those vague internal notices citing unclear documentation structure. It wasn't a formal complaint, but it triggered a flag in the internal retention matrix. One more error and his profile would shift from growth potential to liability exposure. Alec didn't understand why it was happening. He only knew something was moving beneath him, and that none of it made sense. He started asking questions. Meanwhile, Chloe updated her compliance log. She didn't confront anyone. She didn't flag Brandon's memo directly. She just added a line under the clause entry. Contradictory policy communication detected. Legal cross-verification required. It was quiet. But it was permanent. That afternoon, Marta reopened a legacy approval archive, not the one related to fallback routing. Another one, tied to a vendor contract from 2 years ago. Inside it was a memo Julia had written, one that mirrored the structure of the clause now in question. The language was consistent, the formatting exact, even the type of signature block matched. That was the link they needed. Julia's name still didn't surface. But her method did. The metadata showed a pattern, clauses authored under a specific style with recurring structural flags. Marta flagged it as probable author match. Not for credit, but for risk lineage. And that changed everything. Because now, Chloe's clause wasn't just a document floating in isolation. It was part of a lineage, a known structure, one with a history of stopping damage before it spread. Audit opened a deeper review, a chain trace, not just of Alec's work, but of Brandon's sign-off behavior. They started mapping deviations from original drafts, scanning for edits that removed legal fallback triggers without documentation. 2 inconsistencies surfaced immediately, both tied to Brandon, both signed off without evidence of review. And then came the real shift. Instead of routing the inquiry summary to Brandon's office, audit rerouted it directly to the Office of External Risk, a level above Brandon. He didn't know. He was still thinking this was about stream delays and technical clogs. But by then, Chloe had logged a version control discrepancy. Marta had tied clause authorship to a previously dismissed memo. An audit had found 2 prior breaches hidden behind Brandon's approvals. All triggered by the single clause no one thought mattered. What Brandon was retaliating against wasn't rebellion. It was a mirror. And for the first time, he wasn't the one holding it. The audit logs reached a threshold on Thursday morning. 10 flagged clauses, 7 contract deviations, 3 missing sign-offs, and 1 anomaly that no one could explain. A clause buried deep in a contract with a shipping logistics firm, Hadmore International. It hadn't been touched in over a year. It was short, unremarkable, titled Hold Release Conditions, Logistics Stream V3. But unlike the others, it didn't reference fallback logic. It referenced something else. Contingency response immunity. No one in the current legal team remembered drafting it, no initials, no signature. But it was precise, and it had stopped a claim in its tracks 13 months ago. That much audit could prove, because Hadmore had in fact submitted a legal complaint during a Q4 delay window last year, alleging breach of delivery structure due to routing latency. It was serious, high risk, the sort of thing that triggers board-level escalation. Except it never made it to the board because the clause in question neutralized it instantly. The immunity defined in the language gave Altera the right to reroute unilaterally under specified conditions, conditions that matched exactly what had occurred during the delay. The complaint was dropped within 72 hours. No media, no public record, just a closed case. And now, no one remembered who had written the clause that saved it. The internal compliance case summary noted, clause prevented escalation, author unknown, insert origin untraced, saved estimated $3.8 million exposure. It was a ghost win, the kind that doesn't show up in quarterly highlights, the kind that never gets someone promoted. Julia had written it, but her name wasn't on the clause. She drafted it on a Sunday afternoon and submitted it through a legal assistant while covering for another teammate on sick leave. There had never been a reason to claim credit. The clause had done its job. That was enough, at the time. Now it was a problem, because audit was comparing that old clause to the current one from Servos. The patterns matched. The phrasing structure was nearly identical. The logic build followed the same sequence. But this time, the protection was missing. Brandon's team had removed it, assuming it was an old holdover, an extra line, something redundant. Now, Servos was escalating in writing. Not legal yet, but asking questions with sharper language. Their risk team had noticed the missing protection. They wanted confirmation of approval and documentation trails. Audit had no answer. And for the second time, a contract Julia had once sealed was bleeding again. But there was no Julia in the system anymore. No account, no title, no role, just clauses without names, and people trying to explain why they ever thought they were optional. By Friday morning, the finance team received a quiet ping from audit. Just a notation. Pending exposure scenario from Servos routing deviation. Legal estimates needed. It didn't raise alarms at first. Operational flags were common, especially during integrations. But as the legal summaries were pulled, a trend emerged. The clause that had stopped Hadmore's claim last year wasn't the only one. 5 similar deflections had occurred in the past 3 years, each one preventing formal litigation, each resolved before escalation, each involving contracts that had no assigned owner in the system. It was Marta who compiled the list. Each clause bore the same structural rhythm. Each outlined a narrow risk path. Each shut down exposure from logistics partners, vendors, and compliance queries before they became costly. Altogether, they had prevented an estimated $6.12 million in claims. Not one of them had been credited to anyone, not even once. The legal team tried tracing origin IDs. They found nothing. The clauses had been entered from different devices, passed through temporary logins, submitted under team logins, batch uploads, or in-person briefings that had never been logged formally. Which made one thing clear: someone had been protecting the company quietly for years. And the company had no idea who. Until now. Because one of the clauses, submitted during the old Hadmore dispute, had been printed physically before being uploaded. The assistant who handled the document no longer worked at Altera, but the paper copy remained in storage. On it, in blue pen, was a single line of handwriting, just a name for internal reference. Julia Vance. The signature was informal, not binding, but it was enough. Audit didn't publicize the finding, but the chain was updated. And for the first time in over a year, Julia's name re-entered the internal records, under a field titled, Contributor, Legal Risk Deflection, Historical, Unassigned. It didn't appear on the dashboard. It wasn't sent to Brandon, but it was seen. And once it was seen, it couldn't be unseen. Finance compiled a report. Quiet. Internal. Sent only to the board's audit liaison. The title was cold. Projected exposure increase from fallback clause removal. $5.7 million, active. $6.12 million, historical averted. No commentary, no attribution, just numbers. And one note at the bottom. Key clauses no longer present in current contracts. All authored by now exited personnel, none replaced. The report didn't say mistake. It didn't need to. By the afternoon, Servos had sent another notice. This time not from technical, from legal. They were requesting formal correspondence within 7 business days regarding responsibility reallocation in case of escalation. That was legal phrasing. Polite, precise, and final. Altira had no clause to stop them anymore. The system that had once absorbed risk had been emptied, quietly, line by line. And now, for the first time, the cost of silence had a number attached to it. But no one dared say whose silence it had really been. On Monday morning, Altira received formal notice. Servos was moving forward with legal action. The letter was sharp but clinical. It cited breach of redundancy protocol, failure to disclose fallback removal, and operational misrepresentation during integration. The claim? $5.7 million in damages tied to shipment delays, server-side failure, and unrecoverable processing costs. The legal department froze. They had no defense. The clause that would have blocked the claim had been removed 2 months earlier. No override form existed. No documentation supported the change. Just a gap in the archive, followed by a pattern of silence. Brandon requested a closed-door meeting. He blamed operational urgency, called it a systems miss, suggested Servos was bluffing or fishing for leverage. But when asked whether legal had cleared the fallback adjustment, he couldn't produce a single message. Because none existed. What he didn't expect was the response from audit. Instead of routing the litigation file back through operations, the board's risk committee requested an independent review. Marta was tapped as liaison. Compliance was asked to trace the full clause trail across all past contracts. That request triggered something buried. Chloe reopened a compliance log from the previous year. Inside it was a recording, audio from a legal prep session during Hadmore's post-incident debrief. She'd kept it for reference, never flagged for deletion. In the recording, one voice broke through. Clause 13.4 isn't there to look smart. It's there because if Hadmore ever flips, we lose all leverage. The voice was unmistakably Julia's. The file wasn't confidential. It had been part of team review, but no one had ever listened to the full playback. Now it was cataloged under Prior Legal Defense Guidance, Clause Origin Insight. The quote didn't solve the current crisis, but it changed the tone. Because now, Julia's clause wasn't just a forgotten safeguard, it was a known defense, acknowledged, recorded, explained, and removed, knowingly. Suddenly, no one wanted to own that removal. Legal offered one option: early settlement. Servos had proposed a figure, $4.2 million, to close the issue without litigation. It was steep, but not catastrophic. Not yet. Brandon refused. He insisted the clause was obsolete. That fallback logic had outlived its purpose. That Julia's methods were overcautious, outdated. He recommended a counteroffer, half the amount. Chloe didn't speak. Marta didn't either. But the next day, Chloe filed an internal preservation request. Not to cover herself. To ensure no one deleted the recording, she added a single sentence to the metadata. Clause removal occurred post-warning. Verbal caution on record. The company wasn't just exposed now, it was cornered. Julia had never come back, never sent a message, never demanded credit. But her absence was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. It had a dollar value. It had a voice, recorded, archived, ignored. And now it had consequences. The board meeting was brief. Less than 40 minutes. The litigation risk, the clause removal, the audio from Julia, all had converged into one outcome. Altira had no credible defense, and the person who had once architected the company's legal fallback structures was no longer on payroll. No one said her name at first. It appeared only once in the final recommendation memo from Marta. Proposal, external contract, 90-day review authority, scope limited to Servos negotiation. Advisor, J. Vance. The vote passed. 5 in favor, 2 abstained. Brandon objected, but he no longer held final say. The request was sent not by HR, not by legal, but directly from the board's external counsel team. It wasn't a rehire, it wasn't reinstatement. It was something else entirely. A contracted intervention. No office, no title, no profile in the company directory, just a code badge, and a closed access pass to archived infrastructure. Julia entered the building without announcement. No one greeted her. She didn't stop at reception. Her name wasn't listed on the agenda, but her badge unlocked a floor that had been restricted since the data lockdown 2 weeks earlier. She didn't take the main elevator. She used the stairs. In room 2C, she sat alone with the Servos contract binder, a legal pad, and a silent terminal. No one joined her. She didn't ask for updates. She didn't read the news feeds. She opened the contract, marked 7 points in red, then began writing. Pen on paper, the way she always had. No flourish, no summaries, just layered clause logic and fallback algorithms that could survive litigation exposure. What she handed in 90 minutes later wasn't a defense. It was a reconstruction. Her revised draft reframed the dispute not as a breach, but as a delay within contractual tolerance, defined by past precedent embedded in older vendor relationships. The argument wasn't emotional, it was structural. Legal couldn't refute it, servos couldn't disprove it, and compliance could trace every reference. The draft included 3 attachments, one from the Hadmore archive, one from a manufacturing clause Julia had authored 6 years ago, and one from a transport delay settlement that had never gone public. Together, they told a story the company had forgotten how to tell. And when the settlement offer was submitted, rewritten, precise, humble, it didn't include excuses, just context. Servos responded within 48 hours. They accepted the revised structure. The penalty was reduced to $100,000, classified as a technical realignment, not a breach. No admission of fault, no lawsuit. Julia didn't wait for acknowledgement. She didn't attend the debrief. She didn't even reclaim her old files. She left through the side exit without speaking to anyone. The badge was deactivated before sunset, but the file she submitted remained in the legal archive under the temporary folder name Final. Its metadata contained no author tag, only one phrase in the footer. Reinstated by structure, not by title. The aftermath wasn't dramatic. There was no press release, no internal memo celebrating the resolution. Just a quiet update in the board report. Servos matter resolved. No further action required. Brandon didn't attend the next leadership sync. He wasn't invited. His calendar access was revoked that same evening. His profile, still visible in the directory, was marked on transition. There were no announcements, no farewells, just one less voice in the rooms that mattered. But the impact wasn't measured in his absence. It was measured in the gaps he left behind. For the first time in over a decade, Altira's legal structure had no owner for risk design. Compliance was handling technical patches. Operations was rebuilding escalation paths. But no one was planning the next firewall. They thought they could operate without one, until Chloe submitted her resignation. No warning, no negotiation, just a 4-line notice sent to legal and audit, copied to no one else. Effective immediately. She didn't stay for exit interviews. She didn't take meetings. She submitted her final compliance log with a single message in the audit field. Firewalls don't argue. They absorb. It wasn't a quote. It wasn't attributed. But everyone understood what it meant. Because everyone remembered what nearly happened. Without the clause, without the fallback, without the structure Julia had once built, the company would have entered litigation blind. They would have bled. And no one would have seen it coming. Not because they weren't watching, but because they had disabled the one person who had built the defense. Julia never returned. Not to the building, not to the calls, not even to collect any paperwork. But outside the company walls, something else was forming. A boutique legal risk advisory, incorporated under a clean new name. No press, no announcement, but a growing list of clients, each one tied to previous partners who had once worked with Julia under Altira's shadow. She didn't advertise. She didn't pitch. But her name circulated quietly between compliance officers, litigation advisors, and board auditors. The clients who came didn't ask for decks or bios. They asked one question: can you prevent what nearly happened at Altira? And that was enough. The firm grew, not fast, but solid. And Chloe? She joined within 2 weeks. The same Chloe who once dismissed Julia as too rigid, too slow, too protective. Now she handled client onboarding, policy translation, and escalation mapping. Exactly the things Julia had once trained her to ignore. Because sometimes the only way to understand a firewall is after the fire gets too close. And by then, the only thing left to do is rebuild from the ashes. The company didn't collapse. There was no scandal, no leaked emails, no court subpoenas. Just a settlement paid, a contract quietly rewritten, and a leadership chart slowly rearranged. Brandon's name disappeared from internal systems 2 weeks later. He was given a consulting exit. No press, no headlines. The kind of departure designed to fade. But the mark he left remained. Risk protocols had to be rebuilt from scratch, Documentation had to be revalidated. Clauses Julia had written, then discarded, were now treated like artifacts. Studied, mimicked, but never fully understood. The legal department opened a retroactive attribution process. It didn't name names, but it tried to reconstruct authorship for historical contract components. The effort was bureaucratic, flawed, and slow. In the final report, under unassigned preventative actions, 6 entries appeared, each credited to unknown contributors, each worth over $1 million in saved liability, each without metadata. One of them bore Julia's structure, but her name didn't appear. It didn't need to, because by that time, Julia had already sent her final message. Not a letter, not a statement, just a memo. An old one that had been ignored years ago. Buried in a folder titled Administrative Drafts, Q1 Restructure. No one had opened it during the reorg. No one had read past the title. Until now. It contained no emotion, no accusations, just 3 lines. Cost center, avoided litigation liability, 6.12 million attribution. Not required outcome, stable. There was no author field. But the handwriting was Julia's. It was filed before she was removed, before the clause was stripped, before anyone realized what she'd been protecting them from. It didn't ask for credit, it just documented impact. The memo made its way through the system. Legal tagged it for archival. Audit attached it to the final servos case file. Finance cross-referenced the numbers. And the board? They didn't respond. They just made one internal update. A new position appeared on the org chart. Director of Risk Architecture. A title that had never existed while Julia was there. A department that no one had valued until they saw what it cost not to. Julia never applied. The firm she built continued growing, quietly, effectively, without branding, without advertising. And everyone at Altira understood one thing clearly now. They hadn't fired a lawyer. They'd fired the firewall, and no one inside would ever dare pull that trigger again.